Right then folks, welcome to another C's Gearbox video. Today's video is going to be a little bit different. We're going to do a bit of a vlog and we're going to talk today about classic car tax exemption. So in the UK, once a car hits 40 years old, it is exempt from tax. And this is good news for many of us who run older cars. But more recently, the media has been starting to talk about the possibility that in the next budget on the 26th of November, the Chancellor is going to revoke that 40-year tax exemption. And we're going to look in this video and we're going to say, okay, is that likely to happen? What are the facts? What do we know? Try and come to a bit of a conclusion as to why it wouldn't be a good idea to do that. So as you can see, a picture above my head, but also I'm going to try and put a picture on the screen as well. This is my 1985 Citroën 2CV. Manufactured in August of 1985, it became MOT exempt this year in August, but I have to wait until next April for it to become tax exempt. Well, in theory, is it going to become tax exempt? Because, of course, if the government does change the rules in November, maybe my Citroën will be one of those cars that falls foul of that rule and doesn't ever get to be tax exempt. The tax exemption system in Britain for classic cars has been around for quite a long time. And initially, it was actually changed in 1997 when it had been a rolling 25-year exemption. But in 1997, the government sort of stopped the rolling nature of that exemption and capped it at 1973. So only cars produced before 1973 were exempt. And that ran all the way until 2015 when a 40-year rolling exemption was brought in. So once the car hits 40 years old, it's exempt from the MOT test. And the following April, it becomes exempt also from the car tax or the vehicle road fund license that is due as well. And that's been the case now for the last 10 years, and the 40-year rolling exemption has been there, and it seems pretty fair. So the question is, it's been there for 10 years, it seems to be working, why are we suddenly talking about it? Well, it seems to have suddenly picked up in the media due to the impending expected tax rises that are coming up in the budget. And it was sort of really first flagged to my attention on the front of Classic Car Weekly, where it said, tax exemption under threat. And it kind of gave some kind of thoughts on whether or not tax exemption was under threat, and including quotes from the Shadow Transport Secretary. So that's the Transport Secretary that's in opposition. And he said this, that one of his big concerns is what's going to happen with the 40-year rule and things like that with the budget coming up. He says that the danger is that they're looking right across transport. And that is probably a legitimate concern, isn't it? That transport taxes are something that the government will be considering. We saw last year in the budget there were some tax rises on new cars in particular and the higher polluting models. So we are expecting, we do see, don't we, that this is an area that the government do like to look at. We also recognise that there is no longer a cross-party sort of historic vehicle group within Parliament anymore, which is something that had existed for a long number of years. But since the forming of the new government about sort of just over a year ago, there hasn't been those enthusiasts in government to form that group. So there is no longer a lobby. The other fact is that we do know that there is need in the economy to raise extra funds. And, some estimates say that around £107 million could be added to the public purse by taxing classic cars. And, so therefore there are some reasons why you kind of look and say, well, there's reasons why the government might be looking at that. However, would it be a good idea? Is it the best thing to do? Let me tell you why I don't think it is. First of all, let's look at that figure of £107 million. Where does that figure come from? Well, that figure comes from assuming that we're going to get car tax from all 297,480, yes, I had to read that, classic cars that are currently benefiting from tax exemption. Now, we know, don't we, that all of those cars being tax exempt or being charged a tax, I should say, means that everything from my 1985 Citroën right down to somebody's 1904 de Dion Bouton is going to be taxed. I can't imagine a scenario where they're going to tax cars over 100 years old. It just doesn't seem a likely scenario. It also assumes, to get about £107 million, that those cars are taxed all year. What do we know about classic cars? Well, we know that a large number of them are sawned over the winter because we take them off the road to protect them from the grit and the salt that are on British roads, during that winter time. My Citroën is actually currently sawned anyway, and that's because it's broken rather than because of the winter. That £107 million also assumes that all of those cars are taxed at the over 1.6 rate for pre-2001 cars, which is currently £360 a year. Again, we also know that many of our classic cars have smaller engines than 1.6, including the 602cc of my Citroën. And so therefore that would be charged at a lower rate, around £200. All of a sudden, that £107 million that is potentially benefiting the government seems to have been dropped quite drastically. If we assume that cars are stored for, maybe 5 or 6 months of the year, and we assume that maybe half of them are under that tax break, all of a sudden you can probably half or maybe even less that figure than the government apparently think they might raise from taxing classic cars. So it's not looking so good so far, is it? Additionally, what would really be the benefit of taxing these classic cars for the small amount that they use the roads? Because the average classic car does around 1,200 miles a year. Now, let's again imagine the fact that there's somebody in their 1904 de Dion Bouton probably isn't going to do 1,200 miles a year and may only do a couple of hundred miles a year. Now, if you're going to pay tax all year for a car that's only going to do a couple of hundred miles, the likelihood is you might not pay that tax and you might actually take it off the road. Now, that would be a huge loss, wouldn't it, if we start to lose these classic cars off the road, and all of a sudden that's going to hit the government's potential raking in the cash even further. But the average classic car's 1,200 miles a year really is very, very low. And the average CO2 emissions that creates across a year is around 641 kilograms of CO2 per year. A really small amount. Apparently, I read something on an article that said that's about the equivalent of making 3 cups of coffee every single day. So it's a really small environmental impact, as well as a small, impact on the roads themselves. And that's before we even start to talk about the environmental impact of constantly producing new cars and how reusing and repairing is better for the environment. But let's not go there today, shall we? So looking at the classic cars, the impact that they're having is relatively low. And therefore, an exemption seems really fair. That 1,200 miles of a classic car can be contrasted with around 7,500 miles, which the average modern car does a year, which is actually interesting because I'd always thought the average mileage was around 10,000, but apparently it has dropped quite a lot over maybe the last 5 years or so with the increase of people working at home, etc. So classic cars, they have a very, very small impact, I think, onto the economy in terms of the cost that they have. And we already do pay tax on the use of our classic cars because all of our classic cars, bar a few that have been converted, are of course petrol, and we do pay fuel duty on those classic cars regardless of whether we are in fact paying road fund licence. But then let's also consider that these classic cars don't just take away from the economy, they add to the economy. Depending on whose research you look at, the FBHVC say that it is actually around £7.5 billion added to the UK economy every year from the classic car industry. The Hero Era research, which was conducted a couple of years ago, suggested it was actually closer to £9 billion. Now, that's a huge amount of money generated by the classic car industry. In that figure includes all sorts of things like apparently £371 million from historic racing, over £100 million from motor clubs, and over £120 million from things like magazines and museums, etc. Now, that's a huge amount of money into the economy. The Hero Era report also suggested that around 113,000 people are employed either directly or indirectly in maintaining classic cars and the classic car industry. That's a huge number of people that is employed, indirectly or directly by that sector. Let's imagine a scenario where classic cars were taxed. People start to take their cars off the road and therefore jobs were lost. If just 10% of those jobs were lost, that's around 11,300 jobs were lost, over £40 million in income tax would be lost by the government. So all of a sudden, what we're seeing there is that this 107 million, which we've already eroded down to about half that, is eroded further again. And, as the economy loses businesses, because people no longer can afford to keep these classic cars, then obviously that is going to have a significant negative impact on the economy again. So for all of these reasons, it really doesn't seem like a great plan, does it, to start taxing the classic cars? Okay, so finally, let's think, what has the government actually said about the rolling tax exemption? So since the current government were elected, that hasn't been touched. But in April 2024, it was put to the government by a petition that they wanted to lower the age of the classic historic tax exemption to 30 years. And at that point, the government said this, that the 40-year exemption seemed a fair cut-off. And it did say that there was no plans to sort of change that. Can that give us some comfort? Well, we do know that was 18 months ago, so a lot changes in 18 months. But we can certainly see that this is something that has been considered. We recognise that taxes are probably going to be considered over all sorts of sectors. Maybe the historic vehicles is one. But there seemed to be there a kind of recognition of the value of historic vehicles. And as well as the kind of economic value of historic vehicles, let's not forget the social benefit of historic vehicles. There's a whole reason why channels like this, why magazines like Classic Car Weekly or Practical Classics exist in the first place. And that's because classic cars make us feel good. During the first lockdown, the only vehicle that I actually kept on the road in my household of the 10 or so that I owned was the 2CV. Because every time I drove it, it made people smile. It made me smile. It made others around you when they're doing their official allowed daily exercise. It made people smile. And as I commuted to my key working job in the 2CV, it brought a little bit of happiness. Now, even multiply that out. When I've taken convoys of 2CVs through towns, the smiles, the happiness, the waves, classic cars add so much more to our lives than just the economy, don't they? So therefore, that kind of benefit of cars and also preserving the history, it's so important. And we do know, don't we? If classic cars are taxed, some people will no longer be able to afford them. They will take them out of their lives or just park them up, leave them to fester in the hope that one day they may be able to afford to run them again. And actually what will happen is we'll end up with a lot more rotting shells in gardens. And that would be a real shame, I think, for not just the economy, but actually for our happiness and our well-being. And, when times are tough, we need the things that give us good well-being. Okay, then. So what's my final thoughts? Okay, my final thoughts are this. I think taxing classic cars would be a bad move from the government. That's my long short. And that's not just because I'm a classic car owner. I think when you look at the evidence of how much it potentially would generate in revenue versus how much it could potentially cost, I think that just the numbers just don't stack up. And I'm no economist, and I know that, but there just doesn't seem to be the need to tax classic cars at this point. Really, there are a few options I think open in terms of this. It might be that they freeze the exemption at 40 years, drip feeding a little bit more into the economy each time. It could be that they choose to charge everything at a flat rate, maybe a nominal rate. But none of these things would really answer the sort of £20 billion economic black hole that there apparently is. So it really would be nothing but a drop in the ocean, and the negative effects would be quite significant. We know that the government will have weighed up these things. They'll have the facts, and whether we trust the government to make a good decision, I don't know. But this is not a political channel. We're not going to get into the politics of it. But can we trust them to make a good decision? We have to hope that they will. And I think the good decision here would be to leave classics well alone. And here's hoping that that's what they do, so that I can walk into the post office on the 1st of April 2026 with my V5 and go, I'd like to change my car to historic status, please, and I don't want to pay tax anymore. That would be ideal. I think it would be better for everyone, and we don't want to see classics forced off the road. That's the long and short of it. So you have been watching C's Gearbox. It has been a slightly different type of video today, but thank you very much for watching. I hope you found some of my absolute ramblings useful, interesting, and feel free to comment below on what you think about this hot topic issue. See you all next time. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, jazz, all that stuff, and do those things. Yeah, you get the drift. Enjoy.